Hello everyone and welcome to another Fusion 360 Tech Thursday. My name is Brad Tallis. I'm from Autodesk. Helping me out today is my buddy Aaron, and we wanted to start out by saying we apologize we didn't have a live stream last week, but we were all in Portland at our Autodesk Fusion 360 Academy. We had a blast. It was incredible. In fact, we'll probably do follow-up video. Keep your eye out for that on what went on at Fusion Academy. We're hoping to do it again, and we're hoping to see you. And I want to say hi to everybody that was able to come and actually said hi to me, saying that they watch these live streams. So thumbs up to all of you out there. So today's video is actually kind of funny because I love doing these live streams, and Aaron came up to me and he's like, you know, you have all these really cool tips and tricks, but they're scattered throughout all of these different videos and these different live streams. And so we decided to do a live stream on just my top 20 plus tips and tricks. So we're going to start out with, let me bring up my screen here. So I've also created a PDF document that is linked in the description of this live stream. And so you'll actually have a document that you can reference later on. Okay, so my very first tip. Tip number one, the shift key for tangent line. So I'm just gonna go ahead and draw a circle here real quick. And then I wanna create a line that is tangent to this circle. And you'll notice as I get my cursor near the edge, you see that little X, but if I go ahead and click and move, you'll notice that that line is not tangent. Now I could place the line and then do a tangent constraint, but here's my first tip. If you hold down the shift key while you're clicking on that circle, you'll notice that now when I move my cursor, it's automatically creating a tangent line on that circle. In fact, if I let go, you can see the tangent constraint was created automatically. So you can create some pretty cool shapes here pretty easily. So just hold down the shift key, I'll go ahead and drag, and I was able to create those tangent lines. I'll bet you Aaron's gonna be answering your questions for you, but if any of these tips you didn't know about or you thought was really cool, make sure you mention it in the chat window. That way we know which ones you really like and that we should make sure we cover in upcoming live streams. Okay, the next tip is tip number 2, that the line command actually has a tangent arc built right into it. In fact, you'll notice the icon, you know, has a straight line and then you see this curved segment. So how do you do that? Well, the first thing you do is you click and place a line, but when I'm going to click the second point, I'm going to click and hold. So I'm still holding down my left mouse button, and you can see that it's creating a tangent arc from that endpoint right there. So I can go ahead and let's just go maybe like there. I'll come across, hover for my little snap point, like so, and then click and hold again for that tangent arc. And you can kind of see how I was able to create a slot pretty quickly. Okay, the next tip, tip number 3, is click on an existing dimension to reference this. And this is probably one of my more favorite tips. So you'll notice I have this shape here, and I've got this circle over here. I'm going to go ahead and throw a dimension on that circle. Now you'll notice when I click, it's asking for me to input in a size. So I could, you know, type in 2 or something like that. But what's really cool is if I click on an existing dimension, so I'm going to go ahead and click right there, you'll notice that it puts what looks like D9. So it's referencing this existing dimension. And when I hit enter, sure enough, you can see that that's referencing that dimension there. So if I were to change, for example, this dimension here, so I'm just going to make that, let's just say 2, for example. you'll see that that one will update also to be 2 because it's referencing this existing dimension. Now this is a really quick way to create your sketches. Instead of having to type in 5/8 over and over again or whatever, you could type it in once and then you just click on that dimension to reference it and for all your other 5/8 dimensions. And if for any reason you need to change that 1 to 7/8, all of your other ones will update accordingly. Okay. Moving forward here, I'm going to undo. So tip number 4 is to right-click to see your constraint options. Now with the new user interface update, oh, by the way, I should point this out. We just dropped an update about 2 days ago, and you'll notice that we have newer looking icons and some things have changed or whatever. Next week, I will be doing a live stream on what is new in this latest release. So keep an eye out for that. Okay, so all of my constraints are across here at the top, or I can, pick some more from the menu here. But here's a neat little trick. If I were to click or pre-select, for example, these 2 circles, and then I right mouse click, it will show me the constraints that make sense with what I've pre-selected. And I use this all the time. In fact, I hardly ever go to the menu. Okay, so because I've selected 2 circles, it's saying, well, you could make those circles concentric, you could fix them in place, you could make them tangent to each other, or you could make them equal size, for example. So let me just draw, for example, a line over here, and let's just do maybe a circle over here. Okay, and if I were to pre-select those and right mouse click, it's basically showing me the only constraints I could do for these is to fix them or to make them tangent with each other. But if I had another line over here somewhere, let's just say, and I selected those 2 and right mouse click, we could see we have a lot more options. We could make them collinear, parallel, perpendicular, horizontal, vertical, and equal. So this is a neat little tip. Just right mouse click and see what options you have in your right mouse click menu. Okay. Okay, moving on here. Tip number 5 is typing formulas and fractions into dialog boxes. And I've shown this tip quite a few times in a lot of my live streams, but it's so powerful. I really like it, okay? So for example, I could throw a dimension right here, and it's just some random number right now, but I could say, I want that to be 5/8. So I type in 5/8. And when I hit enter, it figures out that fraction or formula for me. Okay? I could also do formulas. So for example, let me fix this here. I'm going to do a dimension here. Let me say dimension. Again, I want this to be the same as this guy, so I'm just going to click on it, and you'll see it references it. I'll say OK, and that changes the width to be whatever that width is. And then I could come in here and say, for example, I want to put a dimension between these 2, and I want this to be whatever that dimension is divided by 2, okay? And I could even put this into parentheses and say, plus 1.5 or something like that. And you'll see that it actually figured out that formula for me, and it obviously pushed it out, so let me edit that guy. And you'll notice that it remembers my dimension, my formula, I should say. So instead of 1.5, let's just make it 0.5, for example. Okay? So you can type in formulas. You can do cosine, sine, tangent. You could do random numbers. In fact, there's a web page in our help menu that shows all the different formulatic equations that you can do in here. Okay? So it's a quick way of figuring out, for example, like equal spacing or anything like that. I want these to be the same height, so I'll say collinear. Let's just do that and that. Now, of course, they're the same height. Okay. So typing formulas and fractions. And again, I could even do, for example, I could do, let's just say 3/4 minus, 1/4 or something like that. And it'll figure that out for me. Perfect. Okay. Moving on. Let me see where we're at here. I have a bunch of sample. There we go. Let me go back to this guy. I'll finish the sketch. Okay. So tip number 6. Right-clicking after pre-selection shows commands that make sense. And let me show you what I mean by this. So for example, I'm going to click this edge and right mouse click. And it shows me the commands that kind of make sense. Because I've clicked an edge, I could fillet that edge, or I could chamfer that edge. So instead of having to go into the menu and look for those commands, they're right there at my mouse. Let me go ahead and click this cylinder, right mouse click. And you could see, for example, I could create an axis through that cylinder. I could shell this part out, for example. If I were to click, let's just say on a face, for example, I could create a sketch on that face. I could extrude and make that thicker, create an offset plane, or again, shell the part looking into that face. So the right mouse click, I use this all the time. I click on an edge and I say, I want to chamfer that edge with just a 1mm chamfer. Oops. Not 1 inch, let's say 0.1 inches. So there you can see it did the whole chain all the way around. Okay. Same thing with like faces. You click on faces, it shows you what you can do. You can click on parts or bodies. Right mouse click, it'll tell you what you can do. For example, change the physical material, find out what properties it is, move it around, make copies of it, etc. So you've seen me in my previous videos. I've always said right mouse click is your friend, and I really can't emphasize that enough. As you're designing in Fusion 360, pre-select something and then right mouse click. Instead of having to keep going to the menus all the time, you'll find that right mouse click menu and the marking menu is very, very handy. Okay. This tip, not a lot of people know about. Tip number 7, show dimensions on the 3D model. This is actually pretty cool. So for example, I'm going to open my sketches folder over here, and I can see that I have 2 sketches. I'm going to go ahead and turn on that sketch, and you can see it shows me my sketch. But if I right click on that sketch, there's an option here that says show dimension. And when I click on that, it actually highlights all of my dimensions. So I could come in here and make changes. So for example, instead of 1.125, let's just make that 0.75, and it'll update my 3D model using those dimensions. So instead of having to go into your sketch, make a change, exit your sketch, and then see what happens, you could actually do it right here on the 3D model. Now you'll notice it gets a little crowded, so you might turn off the ones you don't need, turn on the ones you do need. Now I don't have any dimensions on this one, but if I did, I'd be able to edit those dimensions. So neat little trick. Okay. Okay, next tip. Again, I keep saying this is my favorite. I must have like 25 favorite tips. The re-anchor command. I think this one is really cool. So I'm going to hide my dimensions and turn off my sketch. Okay, so the re-anchor command. So for example, if I wanted to pull this face forward, I'm going to say press pull, and I'm going to start to drag. Now it's not going to let me because of let me turn off my fillets first. Let me do that. Let's just back up and do it maybe something like this. Yeah, maybe I'll do it on this back face. I'll say press pull, and I'll start to drag. Now what it's showing me is that I've moved 0.86 inches, or minus 0.86 inches, from where that face originally was. Okay, well maybe I'm more concerned about the overall length. So if I click on this little down arrow next to the dimension, you'll see it remembers, here's another tip I actually didn't have in this list, it remembers your previously typed in commands that you've done before, but there's this re-anchor command. And so I'm going to say re-anchor, and I'm just going to click on that face. And now you'll notice that the distance is basically measuring from that other face. So it's saying right now the total length is minus 2.235. Well, I want it to be minus 2.5, and it is now 2.5 inches thick because we re-anchored the measurement from the original face to this new face over here. It's a really powerful command. You can also find that command in the down arrow next to the distance in the dialog box. So you can see the re-anchor command there also. Okay, so let me do that one more time because it's so powerful. Again, I click on the face. I'm going to do a press pull or an offset. And I'll just start to drag, and you can kind of see where it's referencing from. And I don't want it to reference from that. I'm going to say re-anchor, and I want to reference it from a different face or a different point. Doesn't matter, edge, etc. So I'm going to just say that face. And then I can specify the distance, minus 2.125 or something like that. And now the total length is 2 1/8. Perfect. Okay. Another cool command. Let me go ahead and undo. I'm just going to drag this back to the end. The probe through selection. I use this quite often, and you've seen me do this in previous live streams. So for example, I want to select this face and I want to select this face over here. And I'm having to rotate around to do that. Well, here's a neat little trick. If you click and hold for about a second, you get this probe through selection. So you can see face, and it's almost like you're shooting a laser through your object. So the very first thing it's going to hit is this face, and then you'll notice it finds that face that we can't see, and then the laser would hit that flat face, and then finally it would hit that back face. So I could select a lot of objects or faces here without having to rotate the part around. And I don't know if I'll be able to do it or not, but let me just do something like this. I'll click and hold. So here you'll notice I get a lot of options. Faces, vertexes, edges. So you can see it gives me a lot of different options here, especially depending on where your laser is pointing. Okay, so for a prime example, I could come in here and say press pull. I'll click that face. I'll click and hold to grab. I mean, maybe I wasn't quite. Go like that. Well, do that again. Let me go click, click and hold. I'll grab that other face. And now when I do a press pull, it'll actually do both faces at the same time. Okay. Neat little tip there. I use that one a lot. Okay, this one is, I think, a great tip that not a lot of people use. It's not that it's hidden or anything like that. You can rename any of your features down here in your timeline. Okay, so for example, I could come in here and let's just say this guy. Oops, let me click out of it. If I just hover over it, you see it says Sketch 1. Well, I could right click on it and say rename and call that main sketch. Okay, and now you'll notice this one says Sketch 2, but if I hover over this one, it now says main sketch. So I could come in and, you know, basically rename any of these features, and I'll just say major fillets. Okay, and then this guy here, I could say minor fillets or something like that. Oops, let me make sure I'm clicking the right one. rename. I could even say, you know, 0.0125 fillets or whatever. So you can rename your features down here. And now when I hover over that, you can see it gives me a better description of what it is. Major fillets. This just says extrude 4, which really isn't all that helpful. Okay? But by renaming these, I know, okay, that's my main sketch. And this is a pretty simple example, but when you start getting more complex timelines, it really does benefit you to rename some of these features. So that way you know what they're for and what they're doing. Okay. Here's another cool trick, or tip, I should say, is if I right mouse click, I get what's called this marking menu. And you'll see this blue kind of radar moving around. And at the 12 o'clock, it's repeat the last command. So tip number 11 is repeat the last command. And so this one's kind of boring. It's a rename. So let me do something a little bit different here. I'm going to go ahead. Let's just put a small chamfer. Let's do a 0.1 chamfer on there. Okay. Now, if I right mouse click, you'll see at 12 o'clock is that repeat chamfer command. So instead of having to go up here and pick the chamfer command or whatever, all I have to do is right click and drag straight up, and it's going to repeat the last command. Okay? So then I could pick on another edge and put a chamfer on that edge, for example. And this works in sketches. So for example, if I were to draw a circle and I escaped out or whatever, I could right click and repeat center diameter circle. Okay, so I use that one a lot. I just drag straight up, boom, I'm in the circle command. Okay, maybe I do a trim or something like that, and I get out and I'm like, okay, repeat the trim command. So right click and drag straight up. Now, with that said, this is not part of my tip, but this little black line is what we call a gesture, and that's what's actually happening when you drag straight up. You're repeating that last command. Well, notice if I go at 6 o'clock, it says sketch, and it brings me kind of to this sub menu here, and I can see at 10 o'clock is circle, at 2 o'clock is rectangle, at 6 o'clock is line, etc. So check this out. I'm not in any command right now. I'm going to drag down into 2 o'clock, and there's my rectangle. I'm going to drag down and 10 o'clock, and there's my circle. Okay, or you could use the shortcut keys. I'm going to drag down and straight down, and there's my line. Again, this takes a little bit of getting used to, but you can kind of see you have access to your dimensions, to your spline, to project, offset, etc. using this marking menu. Okay, let's finish our sketch there. Tip number 12 is window selections. Make sure, hopefully everybody can hear me okay and all kind of stuff. I'm kind of glancing over at the chat. It looks like Aaron's pretty busy. Okay, tip number 12, window selections. This is actually pretty cool. So for example, I could come in here and say, I want to delete some stuff. And I'm going to drag from left to right. And notice where my window is. I'm going to let go. And it selected all of the faces that were inside of that selection window. Okay? And only the faces that were fully enclosed inside of that window. However, if I were to drag, let me go delete. If I were to go from right to left, notice I get a different looking selection window. And this is actually what's called a crossing window. And it actually selects the whole body because it crossed over the body. Okay? So there might be situations where you want to grab everything that's inside the window and that's also crossing. You will do that from right to left. But if you only want to select what's inside the window, you go from left to right. And you can kind of visually see the difference there. So a neat little tip there. Okay. I'm going to back this up again real quick. Let's go to here. This is another neat little tip. I want to fillet a bunch of edges. So I could come in here and say fillet, and then I could start selecting these edges. But that takes quite some time to do that. Okay? Well, there's a neat little trick. If I come in here and say fillet, instead of selecting the edges, I instead select the face. It's going to actually grab all of the edges that have to do with that face. So you can kind of see how it's filleting all of those edges at once. So it's almost like a selection set by face. And I find this really useful. Instead of having to manually click a bunch of edges, I can just come in here and grab that face, and I've just selected all of those edges. In fact, let me just go ahead and click on that guy and click on this face, and notice what we've done. We've basically blended or filleted all of those edges, and there's probably what, 15, 20 edges I would have had to select doing that. So you can select by face, and you can also select by feature. So what do I mean by that? Well, I could come in here and say, for example, fillet. And in fact, it tells you right here, edges, faces, or features. So I could pick, for example, this extrude feature, and it would select all of the edges. Now let me back up. Let me just do this. Say fillet. I'll pick the feature. Let's just do maybe like that extrude feature there. And let's just do the 0.02. And it would select all of the edges that it could. And in this case, it couldn't, probably because of this little tiny thing here. So let me pick a different feature there. Let's do maybe those guys. I'll say 0.02. And sure enough, it selected all of the edges of that particular feature. So kind of a neat little trick. You can do individual edges, or you can do faces, and you can do features. Okay, moving on. And I kind of just showed this, but this is a better example, I think. Select a feature in the timeline to select all of the edges. So, and I just kind of showed this. I kind of jumped ahead. I'm going to say fillet. And you'll notice I have this web in here. So I can actually just click on this web right here. And let's just do 0.1 in this case. Might be too big. Let's do 0.01. Sorry. Yep. Let's go 0.05 or 06 or whatever. And yeah, there we go. So I did 0.05. I selected the web feature, and notice that it selected all of the edges at once. It's a great way of knocking sharp edges or whatever. And again, think about how long it would have taken me to select each individual face and edge and all that kind of stuff. It would have taken a long, long, long time. So instead, just click on the feature in the timeline and you'll get your result there. Pretty cool trick. Okay. Hopefully you're all learning something, I hope. So this next trick, or tip I should say, is I use the shell command to speed up design. And let me show you what I mean by this. So for example, I want to create some kind of a pivoting bracket or whatever. So I'm going to start with just a simple primitive like a box. Let's just make it, 2 by 3 or something like so. And let's make that 2 inches tall. Maybe I'll click on this edge. Here's one of my tips. Right mouse click to see the commands that you can use. Let's just put a large fillet. Let's just do 1.25 in this case. Well, now I want to basically machine away a majority of this. Now I could come in here and create a sketch and then draw a rectangle, okay? And then add some dimensions. This is totally fine, totally valid. Let's make that 0.3. Let's make this 0.3 again. I'll just click on an existing dimension to reference it. I'll do the same thing here. Click on an existing dimension to reference it. And then I could machine this away. Okay? So I'll say extrude and click on that back face. So this is my end result that I want. Well, believe it or not, there's a much faster and easier way. Okay, so I'm going to undo all that. Instead of using a sketch, I'm going to use the shell command. So watch what happens. I click on a face, I'm going to right mouse click, and it shows me the commands that make sense. I'm going to say shell, and I'm going to start to drag. And you can kind of see I'm sort of getting the result that I want, but what about this back face? Well, you can actually continue to add other faces into your selection. So now I could come in here and say I want that to be 0.3, and boom, we're done. Okay, I didn't have to draw a profile. They're all equal wall thicknesses, etc. And it's very easy to come back and make a change. I want it to be 0.4. And if I were to change the size of my model, it will always update. So that shell command is actually quite useful. And you can select more than just one face to look in. Okay, here's another tip that I actually didn't learn until fairly recently. You've heard me in my previous live streams, I always talk about try and make your designs in components instead of bodies. I find it just so much easier to use components. Well, let me show you how you can. There's a couple different ways to create components. So the first way is to come up here to the Assemble menu and say New Component, or you can select it from the menu. And then it brings up this dialog, and you could give it a name. So I'm going to call this, rod or something like that. And I'll say OK, and it creates a component. Well, there's an easier, faster way. If I just right-click New Component, and you'll notice it didn't bring up a dialog box or anything like that. I could click on this guy and say New Component, and notice it now turned this into a subassembly and put my new component underneath that guy. I could come in here and say New Component under that. Let me do another new component under that, and let me do another new component. So I haven't even drawn a single 3D model yet, but I'm basically building my structure. And so, for example, I could now come back and name this, bike assembly or whatever. This guy here we'll rename, oops, let me click on it. We'll just call this wheel assembly. And then finally, tire, wheel, etc. So I find it really fast just coming up here and creating your component at whatever level you want is really, really, really handy. Okay. Okay. I showed this in one of my drawing live streams, and people are like, how'd you do that? So sometimes you want to get like an isometric view. Let me go back to this guy here. Here's my finished part, and I want to create a drawing of this, but maybe I don't like my fillets because I've done so many edits. Maybe I don't like the exact isometric look. Maybe I want to show it more like this, for example, in my drawing, for whatever reason. Well, to do that, you can come up to this named views. I'm going to go ahead and expand this open, and you'll notice that we have some default top, front, right, and home. Okay? But you'll notice home is just a little bit too steep for me. I want my ISO to be more like this. So I can right click on named views and say new named view. And you'll notice it now says named view. And I can give it a name. I could call this my ISO or something like that. Okay? I could do a shape, one like that and say new named view, and let's just call this back or something like that, back ISO. Okay? And then if I were to save this and then create a drawing of this, which I'll do real fast, I'll come in here and say new drawing from design. I'll just leave that all alone. it will actually allow me to pick those named views. So by default, you see front, and there's my front, right, home, but notice the new ones, my ISO and back ISO. So I could say my ISO, and now we're looking, let me change that scale a little bit easier to see. We're now looking at the direction that I wanted in that particular case. Okay, let me make that, let's just make it a solid, for example. Okay, and I could come in here and do another base view, and let's just change that to be the back ISO. And now you're going to see the back ISO. Let's make that 1:1. So my point here isn't how to create a drawing, but it's more that you can create your named views, and I'll just do visible like that. Named views to get certain angles that you might want for your particular design. And that works for, you know, not only in drawings, but same thing for here. Like maybe you're doing a presentation and you can actually drive through your presentation just by clicking on these named views. So as you're, you know, talking to a client or whatever, you can just click down through your named views and kind of show certain things. Okay. I just glanced over the chat. I saw James made a great comment. He was like, I like these tips. Hopefully I can remember all of them. Like I mentioned, I created a PDF document that's linked in the description of this live stream. Make sure you grab that, and then you can have that as a reference. That way you can scroll through and see all the different tips. Yeah, because it's like drinking from the fire hose of tips today. Okay. Moving on. Tip number 18. The control key to control your selection. And you've heard me say this before. For example, when I'm creating a joint type, you'll notice when I'm hovering over this face, I get all these little tick marks that kind of pop up and show all the different places that I could capture, and you see it kind of flashing around. It gets sort of complicated pretty quick, okay? But I want to control my selection. So I can basically like hover and see all the lines, and it just gets really crazy. Well, all I have to do is hover over, for example, this cylindrical face, and I'm going to hold down my control key, and now notice that it's not snapping or trying to get to any of those other edges or faces or anything like that. And I can pick the top, the middle, or the bottom very easily. So same thing over here. You know, it's going to try and capture to all those faces. It gets sort of snappy. All I have to do is get to kind of near where I want, hold down my control key, and now you'll notice it's no longer trying to snap to any of those other faces or edges or snap points. Okay? And then I can snap to the middle there. So, perfect. So that is using the control key to control your selection. And that works with the joint command. That also works with the align command. So you'll notice when you're aligning, you get the kind of the same idea. You see all of these little points and faces that line up and all that kind of stuff. I can hold down my control key, and now you'll notice it's only allowing me to select what's near that face. Okay. Tip number 19. I think this is one of Aaron's favorite ones, and that is the S key. If I hit the S key on my keyboard, I get what we call our shortcut dialog. And this is really, really powerful. I think it's underutilized, honestly. Basically what this allows you to do is you can put your favorite commands into this shortcut. And what's cool about this is this exists in all different workspaces. So for example, if I go to my drawing and I hit my S key, you'll notice I get my drawing shortcuts. Okay? If I'm, let me go back to the assembly here. If I'm in my sheet metal workspace, you know, I get all my design shortcuts. If I were in, let me just switch to, for example, let's go to simulation. I would get my simulation work. I'll just create a study. I get my simulation shortcuts. So you can create your own custom shortcut commands that you want in your design. Okay? So let me show you how this works. I hit the S key and I get all of these commands here. Now these are my personal ones. So how did I get those? Well, it's this search right here. Very, very powerful. So for example, let's say I want to do a pattern. So I'm going to just start typing in P, and you see all of the commands that start with P. I'll just keep typing, and so now I can see pattern on a path, circular pattern, flat pattern, rectangular pattern. Well, I use circular pattern quite a bit, so all I have to do is hit this little up arrow, which says add to shortcuts. And you can see I now have the two patterns that I used quite often right there. Okay? Next time I hit the S key, there's those commands. So if you are working and you tend to do certain things over and over and over again, certain commands, definitely recommend adding them to your design shortcuts. Okay? Now, if you don't want any of those, you just drag them off. You just click and drag these guys off of here, like so. Okay? Now, I also use the search command, especially if I'm coming from a different CAD system and I want to reflect something. So I'm going to start typing in reflect, and you'll notice that there is no command called reflect. It's almost like a help menu to me. So I'm like, okay, if it's not called reflect, maybe it's called mirror. So I type in, oh, there we go. Sure enough, it's called mirror inside of Fusion. So, and you can run any of these commands. So for example, I'm going to type in pattern, and I'll just say plane along a path or whatever, and you'll see that it's actually running that plane along a path command. I actually have some people in my group that actually do these shortcut keys more than they do the menus. They'll actually just search for the command, you know, fillet or whatever, really fast, and then do a fillet kind of a thing. Okay? That also exists inside, if you create a sketch, I'll hit my S key, and you'll notice I have my sketch shortcuts. So here's a lot of my commands I might use in sketching. So that shortcut key exists in a lot of these workspaces. Okay, tip number 20, isolate and unisolate components. Now, you notice with the new update, we don't have the light bulbs anymore. We have these, eyeballs basically, and I can click the little eyeball to minimize that. Okay, and I can turn these all on or off individually, but that can be time consuming, especially if you have a really complex assembly. Instead, I could come in here and say, for example, I'm going to right mouse click on this spur gear, and I'm going to say isolate, and watch what it does. It turns all of the other ones off. And I'm now just basically looking at this individual component. Okay? Then I could right click again and say unisolate, and it turns all of my parts back on. So this is a really great way, so that's the connector rod, of kind of cleaning things up. I'm going to work on my connecting rod for a while, etc., etc. Then I'll just come back and unisolate it and get all my parts back, instead of manually clicking the show and hide icons. Okay. Let's see. Tip 21 is show all components. So again, I could come in here, instead of isolate, maybe I turned off that guy, I turned off my spur gear, maybe we turned off all of these bushings, etc. You know, I've turned off a bunch of these things. Well, now I want to turn them back on. Well, I didn't isolate them, but I could come in here, right mouse click, and say show all components. And it'll turn all of them back on again. Instead of having to manually do it individually, you know, I can just right click and say show all components, or show all bodies if you're using bodies in this case, but we're using components. I'm going to say show all components. Again, a really fast way of doing this. And the only reason I've added this to my list was, I do help quite a few customers, and I'll watch them turn parts on and off, but by clicking the light bulb or the show hide icon on the left, and it just takes a lot of time. And so I'll show them that show all components, isolate, etc., and they're like, oh, I didn't know that existed. Okay. Tip number 22. Let's see where we're at here. So this is actually a kind of a neat little trick. So you'll notice I have a profile right there, and it's buried inside the part. Now you've seen me hover over this, and you'll notice it's wanting to select the front face and not the profile. Now if I were to click and hold for a second, I could probe through and grab that profile. Okay, but here's a neat tip. If I were to run the extrude command, so I'm going to just right mouse click and say extrude, it automatically selects that profile for me because it's the only profile in this case. If I had multiple profiles, this doesn't work. But if you have a singular profile, I can now, I don't even have to select it. It automatically selects it for me. Okay, so let's just do that again. I just go into the extrude command. It automatically selects that profile for me. Okay, tip number 23. Let's see. I'm going to jump into a different sketch here. Let me go into here. Now by default, we typically dimension to like center points or whatever. So you can see I have this 10 millimeter dimension that's kind of going to the center of this slot. I'm going to go ahead and delete that dimension. In fact, I'll get rid of all of these here just to clean things up. Check this out. I'm going to go ahead and go into my dimension command, and you'll notice that it wants to dimension to the center point. But maybe I want to specify the overall length of the slot. All I have to do is right mouse click, and you'll see by default it's trying to go to the center of a circle or arc, but I can switch this to tangent. And now you'll notice when I get near that curve, I get that little X. All I have to do is just click. I don't even have to be very precise. Get over here and click, and now I'm able to specify the overall length of my slot using the tangent option. And again, that was in the right mouse click. Once I'm in a dimension, I'll right mouse click and pick that option. Like I said before, right mouse click is your friend. Okay? Let's see, tip number 24. We're getting close to the end here. Let me go ahead, I'm just going to finish that sketch. And I want to do, let's do a different sketch here. See, this is where naming your sketches make more sense. Okay, here's a better one. Okay, so tip number 24, right click in your sketch dimension to get dimension orientation options. Let me show you what I mean by this. Typically when you click like an edge, it knows that you want to make that, for example, a vertical dimension. Okay, but if I were to create a dimension that went maybe from like the center of this circle to, let's just say, this top corner here, you'll see as I move around, I get a vertical, I get aligned, and if I keep moving, okay, there I get horizontal. But it gets kind of confusing sometimes as you're moving around. It's like, why is it so flashy? And how, I just want it to give me a horizontal dimension. It's not giving me a horizontal dimension. Well, all you have to do is right mouse click, and you get these options: aligned, vertical, or horizontal. If I click on horizontal, it's going to force it to be a horizontal dimension. If I click on aligned, it's going to force it to be an aligned dimension. And then obviously vertical, it's going to force it to be a vertical dimension. Okay? So all you have to do is right mouse click to see those options right there. tip number 25. This is actually a really cool tip that I don't think a lot of people know about. So I've got an assembly here with lots of parts on it. In fact, you can see all of these individual components and stuff like that. And maybe I want to start simplifying this. Maybe I want to turn some on or off so they're not displayed. That would take quite some time. Well, under the Select menu, under Selection Tools, you have a bunch of options. Now, usually we just select by window, right? Well, here I can say Select by name. And maybe I want to select all of the LEDs. So I'm going to just come in here and type in LED, say Find, and notice what it did. It actually found those LEDs. It highlights them in my browser, and it highlights them on the board itself. I can search for bodies, I can search for components, and it tells me how many items it found. So let's do the same thing. I'll come in here and say Select by name, and I'm going to just start typing in capacitor. So I'm going to type in cap, say Find, and it went through and it found 11 objects that have the word cap in it, and sure enough, all these different capacitors. Okay, so that's one great way of quickly selecting things that you've named well, but maybe you haven't named them well. So the other one, I'm going to come back to boundary here in just a second. I use Select by size quite a bit. This is actually really cool. Notice what it did. It already says 10 selected, and I have a slider right here. So I can, and it's actually going to highlight, it's found objects that are 0 to about 2.5 millimeters in size. And if I were to drag this up a little bit larger, you can see that now it's selecting all of the objects that are a little bit bigger. And if I were to keep dragging this, it's going to start adding in more and more objects. Okay, and I'll just keep dragging until now it's getting objects that are 27 millimeters, which obviously I don't want. I just want maybe some of these smaller components like that. How long would it have taken you to select all of those objects manually? You would have had to spend quite some time doing that. Okay, so this Select by size is actually a really cool command. I could delete these, I could move them, or whatever. Select by boundary. This is actually pretty cool. So it's saying, what's the centroid? So maybe I'm just going to grab that component right there, and you'll notice it puts this green little box around it. Well, I can say, you know what, select anything that's inside, and so you can see as I'm dragging that a little bit wider, it's grabbing all of those headers, but you'll notice if I keep going, it's not grabbing that capacitor. And that's because it's not fully enclosed inside this window here. But as soon as I drag this boundary a little bit bigger, you can see that it's going to select that capacitor. I have options. I want a box, do I want a cylinder, do I want a sphere? So I can do a sphere and have it grab anything that's fully enclosed in that sphere. I can say anything that's inside it, or select everything that's outside of it. So I want to keep everything that's inside. So again, you can see kind of the power behind this. Okay, so that's Select by boundary. Then we have invert selection. So for example, let's just say Select by name. I'll do the LEDs again. We'll find those. It's found those 4 LEDs. I could come in here and say select the invert, and it now leaves all of the LEDs alone, and it's selected everything else except for those LEDs. So that's what the select invert is for. So really cool and powerful commands here, especially when you start getting into like FEA analysis. A lot of times you want to simplify your models, and if I were to want to analyze this like for a thermal or something, I might not want all of these components, and I could quickly select them and remove them in my simplification. Okay, and finally, our last keyboard tip is keyboard shortcuts. Again, not a lot of people know about this, but let me just jump back to something here. Pretty simple. So you'll notice that there's keyboard shortcuts for a lot of these commands, like L for line, R for rectangle, but you'll notice there's not any for arc, okay? Maybe I use 3-point arc a lot, and I want to create my own custom keyboard shortcut. So I'm going to click on these 3 little dots right here, and I can pin it to the toolbar, which will put it up here. I could pin it to my shortcuts, so that's going to go to that S key. It's going to automatically put it in my little S key dialog, and then you'll see change keyboard shortcut. So I'm going to click on this, and it says assign a new shortcut key for 3-point arc. Well, I want to use A, but you'll notice it says, well, that conflicts with appearance. You're already using A for appearance. So it will give you some warnings if you can or cannot. So maybe I'm going to say I want it to be Shift A. And this time, it doesn't give me any warnings. So I'll say OK. If I come underneath my arc now, you'll notice it says Shift A next to 3-point arc. And if I were to do a Shift A, I'm in my 3-point arc command that quickly, right? So you can create your own custom shortcuts using that methodology. And this exists in everything. So for example, in here, maybe I use the shell command quite a bit, and there's no keyboard shortcut for shell. We'll come in here. Obviously S is probably taken. Yep, it's reserved. So let's try Shift S. Okay, that conflicts with section analysis. Let's try Alt S. That one's reserved. So maybe I have to do a bunch of different options here. Maybe I can't use S, but I could do Control Alt S in that case, which I tend to not do multiple combinations, but you'll see that sure enough, that works. Okay. Okay. Unfortunately, that was the last tip I have so far. If you know of any other tips that you use quite often, please add them not only into the chat, but into the comments in the live stream. We want to share these with everybody, and we love listening to what you guys have to say. We've done a live stream on what we've learned from you. Hopefully you gleaned a lot from this live stream, and keep your eye out for next Thursday. We have another live stream coming up, and hope to see you then. With that, have a wonderful rest of your day.